Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I'm the International Affairs Program Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this evening's Author Series event. Since the partition of Pakistan from India in 1947, Pakistan's military has been a dominant institution in the country. It has engaged in numerous territorial wars with India over Kashmir, but has not won. Perpetuating a national identity defined by opposition to India, it is engaged in a proxy war, employing Islamist militants in Kashmir. Similar groups received at the minimum tacit support for fighting in Afghanistan in the 1980s and 2000s. Pakistan now faces significant internal threats from these same groups, as well as being left behind as India develops a more prominent global image. To further elaborate on Pakistan's military's continued employment of policies and strategies which appear to perpetuate its insecurity is Dr. Christine Fair. Dr. Fair is an assistant professor at Georgetown University's Center for Peace and Security Studies. She has served as a senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation and a senior research associate in the Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention at the United States Institute for Peace. She serves as a member of the American Institute of Pakistan Studies and on the editorial board of multiple publications, including Asia Policy and India Review. She is also a senior fellow at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center and served as a political officer at the United Nations Assistant Mission to Afghanistan in Kabul. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christine Fair.
Thank you guys for coming out and braving the lousy weather and colds and all that good stuff. So hopefully I won't bore you too much. All right, so here's my question about Pakistan. We usually expect states to change the way it behaves when the tools that it's developed to secure its objectives fail or persistently fail. And in the case of Pakistan, persistently fails to do so for about 6 decades. So as you heard in the opening remarks, Pakistan has launched 3 wars with India, specifically over Kashmir in 1947, 65, and 1999. It's also launched an enduring proxy war, trying to use terrorists to force India to concede, to make some sort of territorial concession with respect to Kashmir and Pakistan. And it lost half of its territory in the 1971 war, which it fought with India. And in that war, it also lost half of its population when East Pakistan became Bangladesh. Not only has Pakistan's revisionism towards India persisted, I also argue in the book that it's expanded. Pakistan has identified for itself a role of resisting India's rise, and we can debate the speed with which India is going to rise, but we can't debate that it is rising. And in consistent documents and statements made by Pakistan's various military as well as civilian leadership, Pakistan sees itself as the singular opposition to India's rise. Now, this would be a problem in its own terms in the sense that for 6 decades, Pakistan has pursued these policies with very little success. But it's even a larger problem for another reason. The very tools that Pakistan has developed has actually turned against the state itself. And specifically, I'm talking about the use of Islamist proxies under its expanding nuclear umbrella. As you know, Pakistan has witnessed, the numbers actually vary. Pakistani sources say 45,000 Pakistanis have been killed by the Pakistan Taliban. Our numbers are still lower, but they're still quite high, in between 4,000 and 5,000. And in any event, that's a very large number. And as terrible as the Pakistan Taliban are, there would be no Pakistan Taliban if Pakistan hadn't first developed these various Islamist militants, which have subsequently turned against the state. So not only has Pakistan's primary tools of managing its relations with India failed to achieve its objectives, it's also imperiling the state itself. So political scientists, and I'm going to say up front, I am not one, expect states to change their behavior under these circumstances. But as I said, Pakistan simply hasn't done so. The conventional wisdom around town, and which animates much of what the United States does with respect to Pakistan, is that Pakistan is a security-seeking state. So in other words, there's some amount of military assistance, some amount of financial assistance that we can give to Pakistan, and Pakistan will finally feel at peace with itself and thus with its neighbors. This also animates thinking about Kashmir. So the thinking goes that if the United States could use its diplomatic power to force some sort of territorial concession between India and Pakistan and have some sort of agreed upon border, that Pakistan will let go of its jihadi proxies. And then by extension, it no longer has to be worried about Afghanistan, and it no longer needs to support groups like the Taliban. And so this gives rise to this thinking that it's more or less characterized as a grand bargain, right? That if we can resolve the issue between India and Pakistan and Kashmir, we can also solve the issues that exist between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this happens, this conversation about a grand bargain emerges just about every time there's a new presidential candidate. So Barack Obama, you might recall, when he was campaigning, again raised the issue of Kashmir. He wanted to appoint an emissary that would be the special representative to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India until the Indians said, no way, we won't give that person a visa. And Richard Holbrooke eventually ended up being appointed as a special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ahmed Rashid, along with Barnett Rubin, and Barnett Rubin was an advisor to this SREP, the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, co-authored a piece in which they essentially argued for this grand bargain, that the United States needs to resolve this so-called Kashmir issue, and this would eventually, in turn, pave the way for peace in Afghanistan. Now, this is a problem, I argue, for a couple of reasons in the book. First, Pakistan doesn't have any legitimate claims to Kashmir. There is certainly a Kashmir dispute, but there is no legal basis that says that there's no legal basis for Pakistan's claims that it should have gotten Kashmir. That is an outright falsehood. And usually, if there were Pakistanis in this audience right now, I would see hands go up and I would see howls of protest. But since I don't see howls of protest right now, I won't elaborate that point unless it comes up in the questions and answer. The other thing that this episodic harping about Kashmir and the floating of a grand bargain does is that it actually bequeaths to Pakistan some aura of legitimacy for its concerns. And it continues to indulge this idea that Pakistan has legitimate equities in Kashmir when in fact it doesn't. And to put it most bluntly, it rewards Pakistan in essence for continuing to use terrorism as a tool for coercion. And I'm going to argue that that's just not something that we should be in the business of doing. So this policy approach, which is one essentially of appeasement, which is based upon this idea that Pakistan is a security-seeking state, I argue in the book is fundamentally flawed. The argument that I put forward in the book is that Pakistan is actually an ideological state. And this is drawing from the work of Charlie Glazer. And Charlie Glazer defines an ideological, which he also calls a greedy state, to be a state that is fundamentally dissatisfied with the status quo, desiring additional territory even when it's not required for security. Now, what's interesting about this is that Pakistan could make an argument about Kashmir that's rooted in security concerns. For the most part, it hasn't done so. And this is actually quite puzzling because that's actually fairly low-hanging fruit. But when I go through the evidence, and I'll describe the evidence that I used to make this argument in a few minutes, it's actually a glaring absence that Pakistan does not frame its Kashmir concerns within the rubric of security. There's one notable exception. The one thing that the Pakistanis are very good at is that they like to hear what Americans are saying, and then they parrot that language back. And they do this as a sort of a rent-seeking strategy. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I believe it was Stephen Cohen, who is one of the premier scholars of Pakistan. He's like the father of this field. Were it not for Steve Cohen cutting this path, none of us would be here studying this subject, because he literally gave birth to this idea of studying militaries in South Asia. But he floated this idea that water scarcity would actually transform what's inherently right now an ideological issue into one that's genuinely a security challenge that India and Pakistan are going to have to contend with. Both India and Pakistan confront severe water scarcity for a number of reasons. And so a few years ago, former Army Chief Kayani came to DC and he had picked up on, oh, Washington is muttering about water. Let me put that out there. And it had some traction for a couple of meetings. These meetings were supposed to be off the record, but you know how off-record meetings actually happen in DC. Oh my God, Kayani, he's talking about water. This is important. This is a change. Well, it wasn't a change, and in fact, it wasn't very long-lived. And Pakistan pretty much dispensed with that because that's not really where Pakistan's argumentation is about Kashmir. As I argue in the book, and as I'll detail at length, Pakistan's interest in Kashmir is largely ideological, and this is the primary intellectual intervention that I'm making in this book. So the implications, again, drawing from the work of Charlie Glazer, are that if you treat a greedy state with appeasement strategies as you would a security-seeking state, you actually incentivize that state to continue to misbehave and to persist in engaging in conduct that you actually don't want to happen. And again, that to me sounds an awful lot like the relationship that the United States has with Pakistan. And as I often joke with my husband, who's actually in the back and without whom I wouldn't be able to write this book because he is such a wonderful husband and such a supporter, he also comes up with the best one-liners. It's like methadone treatment. Right? We're perfectly happy having Pakistan being the addict, but what we don't want to do is fix it. So we just keep the methadone going. And my husband also came up with another, in fact, if I had slides, I'd show it to you, because we went to some effort picking it out together. Any Monty Python fans in the room? It's the Black Knight. It really is the Black Knight. No, it's just a flesh wound. It is not a flesh wound. You lost half your country in 71. That's not a flippin' flesh wound. Oh, I owe that to my husband, actually. He had that concept. So the bottom line is, I argue in the book that we've been treating Pakistan like a security-seeking state, when fundamentally it's an ideological and it's a greedy state. So how do I come about making this argument? So my dissertation long ago was actually in the humanities. So I spent a lot of time in South Asia, many years in Pakistan and India, and in my dissertation, we privilege text and we privilege culture. So I approach this, it's a political science question, why do states remain revisionist? But my primary approach was drawing from my work in the humanities. And so I approach this from the point of view of strategic culture. And in the case of the Pakistan military, it's in some countries, if I wanted to take a similar project, like for example, how does France produce national security policy, I'd have a more complicated puzzle. Because, of course, France has civilian control of the military. I'd have to look at parliament. I'd have to look at a number of institutions and how they interact and how the interagency process works together to produce policy. If I were to do a similar project for the Indian military, I'm not sure I could do this because the Indian military has no say in national decision, foreign policy decision-making in India. In fact, the Indian Army has no seat at all in the big boy table. So in the case of Pakistan, this is a relatively easier task because the Army, for all intents and purposes, controls all of those levers of power that we care about. So we care about jihad policies, we care about Pakistan's relations with India, with Afghanistan, the United States with China, with Saudi Arabia. Guess what? The politicians have no input into this whatsoever. And when the politicians do try to disrupt the Army's preferences, they don't stick around very long. So what you're witnessing right now with Dim and Dimmer in their various twin protests in Islamabad is a manifestation of that, right? Nawaz Sharif wanted to exert greater influence in the India policy domains, he wanted to have a very different relationship with Afghanistan, and of course, he wants to try former dictator General Pervez Musharraf for treason, and the Army's not going to have any of it. So the Army's doing what the Army can do, given its limited tools right now, and that is it's mobilizing street politics to basically wrest concessions out of Nawaz Sharif. So for the purposes of my study, I can reduce Pakistan's strategic culture to the strategic culture of the military. And let me talk a little bit about my data. For those of you who know me, I did go to Pakistan a lot, and until I was blacklisted. Now I can't go for for a number of reasons. But as I like to say, being blacklisted is like being pregnant, right? Once you're pregnant, you can have all the unprotected sex you want. So being blacklisted was not a way to coerce me to shut up. So this shows often, as Pakistan does, their failure to think things through strategically. So I have spent lots of time in Pakistan. I've had lots of interviews with military personnel. I've done their FAM tours in Waziristan and so forth. those have limited utility. And the reason for that is that the Pakistanis lie. And of course, they're not the only ones who lie. I don't want to suggest that. I mean, basically, governments lie, especially when national interests require them to say things that are untrue. But in the case of Pakistan, what's interesting is how much more sophisticated they are in the information management than we are. So the Pakistanis that handle us, they literally have a folder. And virtually every correspondence about a particular issue is in that file. American counterparts are typically young. I could just go on about horror stories of folks over at State and the crazy things that they think. For them to understand information about Pakistan, they could do this thing called read a book, which few of them actually will bother to do because they're so busy. The other thing that they could do is they could bother retrieving all of the cables, but that requires work, and they don't do that. And so what actually happens is that you have a very significant, you have a huge, I'm going to put this delicately, I'm going to call it an information asymmetry that the Pakistanis are able to exploit. And generally speaking, the Pakistanis know their briefs really well. They will tell Americans a very stylized, and by stylized I mean fictitious, version of history. So, for example, one of my favorite Pakistani lies is that you sucked us into your jihad to fight the Afghans, or to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. That's just simply untrue. Pakistan had its own jihad policy. They began it in 1974. We sanctioned them for nuclear proliferation in April of 79. So clearly, if we had intended to suck them into a jihad, we were really stupid about it. Another thing that I love to hear is that you screwed us over by not giving us the F-16s. Well, the F-16 story is much, much more complicated than that. But generally speaking, when they interact with their American counterparts, the American counterparts don't know this complex history. And what they're able to do is to create this ossified sense of guilt that, you know, America is this great big country and we've consistently exploited this poor country and we owe them. So, you know, this nonsense doesn't work so well with me. As you might imagine, when they started, I kind of, you know, tell them that they need to cut it off, that this is actually not working and it's really vexing. But every once in a while, they'll say something that they were not supposed to say. Or more importantly, because they don't know that I read Urdu, that I would see something written, like when we went to North and South Waziristan, I was able to see from the stuff on the wall that what they were saying simply what literally there was writing on the wall that completely contradicted what I was being told. So in general, I find that the interviews that I've had with Pakistanis are very rehearsed. They're only useful in the sense that I hear what it is that they want me, what their official talking points are supposed to be. And it's only in the accidental exchanges that part of the truth leaks out. So I do find that the interview-based reporting that happens here that happens here in DC about Pakistan to be deeply flawed, especially when the recipient of this information hasn't spent a lot of time in the region. You spend about 6 years in Pakistan, and then you'll start to realize, oh my goodness, oh, okay, we are really being taken for a ride. But usually people that have the Pakistan portfolio in these various billets, they're rotating long before they hit that, oh my gosh, we're being lied to saturation point. And I call this liability of newness that the Pakistanis are constantly able to exploit. So what I primarily rely upon in this book is actually their own publications, which actually has made them very, very angry that someone has had the nerve to expose what it is they write about, even though these things are completely available in most libraries. And oh my gosh, shocker, they're actually written in English. So in other words, to anyone with a little bit of tenacity and a research budget, you can easily assemble all of these. And I might add, invest in a scanner. I've saved thousands of trees with this little scanner that fit in my backpack. So I'm primarily relying upon 6 decades or so of Pakistan's defense writings. And I'm going to privilege things that are published by GHQ, by ISPR. There are also myriad memoirs of different generals. And those are also really quite interesting to read as well. So my primary evidentiary base is really this set of writings that go back for quite some time. And what's interesting about them is that if you were to read India's counterpart journals, there's a lot of variation and evolution in how Indians think about things and how they write about things. They write about past operations. Why am I sniggering? Well, when you read Pakistan's journals, they don't write about their past operations. I mean, it's surreal. Even during the Soviet Jihad, there were maybe 2 articles that actually dealt with things. Well, this is particularly in the Pakistan Army Journal. There were only 2 articles during that entire period that even mentioned the operations that were going on in Afghanistan. In the later period, in 2004, when the Pakistan Army went back into Waziristan, again, nothing was mentioned in the Pakistan Army Journal. It was as if they weren't doing anything there at all. It's really quite extraordinary. What they did do is they republished some lousy stuff from Olaf Caro from the turn of the century. So it's almost as if the pages of these military journals are for a different purpose than what our journals are for. And I'm going to argue that that's exactly the case. In our military journals, it's a venue where we're passing on lessons learned. It's a venue where we can institutionalize experiences from different theaters. Pakistan's journals are used largely for ideological purposes. So I can't tell you how many times I had to read about the Battle of Al-Badr in Pakistan's Army Journal. And this is, of course, a Quranic battle. And this would be very common. There would be, they would have an orbat, an order of battle, and it would say the number of Momin, the number of Muslim faithful, and then the number of kuffar. Unless you're a Muslim here, that would be you are a kuffar. And then it would have the Momin-kuffar ratio. And of course, the Momins are always swamped by the far more numerous kuffar, maybe 1 to 100, maybe 1 to 1,000, maybe 1 to 10,000. But in every case, of course, the Momin would prevail despite having inferior weapons and of course, because they're being completely outnumbered. And at first, you're kind of like, why in the world is the Pakistan Army Journal publishing this? And they'll do it over and over and over again. I literally could count. Probably 7 times these things occurred. Very similar articles, almost the same articles occurred in the same journal in relatively brief spans of time. And so you have to pay attention to this. Another thing that the Pakistan Army journals would do would be talking about the role of Islami tarbiyat in creating a Muslim officer corps. Translating Islami tarbiyat is a little bit difficult because it's not just education. It's also about culture, about behavior. It's about being a well-rounded human being, but informed by Islami tarbiyat as opposed to other forms of being a good human being. So you'll find throughout this literature an enormous reliance upon these Islamic themes. And I'm gonna go through them more systematically. But the point is, this is the primary evidentiary basis that I'm using in this book to make the arguments that I make. So let me kind of go through some of the top line conclusions. And they will admittedly run into each other. It's a little bit like pulling that string in your sweater. If you keep yanking on it, the next thing you know, you have no sweater on. So these things necessarily are interwoven and they interlap. So the first thing that really comes across, and I have to say consistently so, whether I'm looking at a piece of literature from the 50s or something that I just picked up yesterday, it never goes away, is this idea that Pakistan was born an insecure state as a result of an inherently unfair partition process in 1947. Now, on this, I'm going to give the Pakistanis credit. For those of you who know about South Asia, this idea that India and Pakistan were equal inheritors of the Raj, that's simply unfair. Pakistan is more like that symbiotic twin that somebody lopped off and it managed to crawl out of the garbage pail and say, look, 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 I'm alive. Why do I say that? Well, basically, all of the main infrastructure of British administration stayed within India itself. So whether it was the Indian Administrative Service, whether it was all of the military training facilities except for the facility out in Quetta, obviously all the ordnance factories, everything that was important stayed within India. The part that became what is now Pakistan, West Pakistan, also had a very different experience from a different experience of colonialism from those parts that became India. So when I talked about this in my class, I like to remind my students that the Brits rolled up in Bengal at about the 16th century, right? The 16th century. NWFP became a province within the Raj only in the early 20th century. So we're looking at hundreds of years of difference and hundreds of years of different levels of exposure to bureaucratization. So what the Brits were able to do in terms of indigenization, in terms of building local governance capacity in those parts that became India, what became today's Pakistan had virtually nothing. There was no history of ruling or governing this part of the territory from Karachi. So everything had to be started from scratch. And the Pakistan Muslim League that secured Pakistan's independence had really two tasks. One, and it had to choose one because it couldn't do both, build the country or build the party. And it ended up trying to build the party and the bureaucracy. So let's think about the army in particular for a second, if you will. The British, when they built the security architecture of the Raj, it was intended to fend off two primary imperial threats. To the north and to the west, it was Russia, and to the north and to the east, it was China. And when Pakistan was cleaved off from the Raj, it had maybe a tenth of the resources of the Raj to contend with what was seen to be the most active and worrisome threat frontier. So this idea of strategic depth that you hear so much about, so many people want to say that this is new. It's not. They actually inherited it from the British. And you can imagine what GHQ, and of course the first army chief was not actually Pakistani, right? He remained a Brit. Ayub Khan was the first army chief. So imagine what you must have felt like if you were Pakistan's early leaders. You had to set up a country virtually from nothing. And the first thing that happened was Pakistan went to war with India. And this meant that India was not at all inclined to give Pakistan its due share and its financial remuneration for those parts, those fixed assets that obviously couldn't be transferred to Pakistan. And why didn't India want to do this? Because Pakistan started the war. So this idea that Pakistan was born an insecure state, and that partition was both unfinished and also unfair, animates much of what the Army continues to say and to think about India. Related to this is this notion of the Pakistan Army having to defend the ideology as well as the geography of Pakistan. Actually, today on the Twitter sphere, Hamid Gul gave another speech about why the ISI has to protect Pakistan's ideology. So this is actually, this every day you can find some current or former general opining about the importance of Pakistan's ideology. Why in the world does it do this? If the American Army chief were to say our job is to defend the American ideology, he would be sacked. I'm pretty sure he'd be sacked. I hope he would be sacked. If the Indian Army chief made a similar statement, he would most certainly be sacked. So what does this mean? So first of all, what is the ideology of Pakistan? The ideology is the two-nation theory and of course, tightly intertwined with that, this notion of Islam. The two-nation theory, Pakistanis in their Pakistani classes learn a very selective retelling of what the two-nation theory was. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah used this idea of the two-nation theory. Initially, it was supposed to be a political argument that said Muslims and Hindus are equal nations. We might be fewer in number than Hindus, but we're equal nations. And he actually had hoped to use the two-nation theory to secure equal number of votes in a unified parliament in a unified India. Of course, the Indian National Congress said that's absolutely crazy. We're not going to make that concession. And both the Muslim League, which was led by Jinnah, and the Indian National Congress, as they couldn't agree about this formulation going forward, they were also very afraid that the British would change their mind about the accelerated plan of departing from the subcontinent. And basically they said, Indian National Congress said, screw it, have your Pakistan. And so in some sense, Jinnah wasn't able to imagine how to set up this Pakistan because many people think he really didn't expect to get Pakistan. The idea that Pakistan was going to be an independent state really came late to the game. Now, when Pakistanis learn about the two-nation theory, they learn that from the beginning it meant a demand for an independent Pakistan. That's simply not true. But this idea that that Muslims cannot live together with Hindus is the fundamental undergirding concept of this two-nation theory. And so you will find Pakistan army chiefs saying, and virtually every single one of them has said it, that the only way that there can be peace between India and Pakistan is if India accepts the two-nation theory. Now, of course, India can't accept the two-nation theory, because if India were to accept the two-nation theory, that is completely orthogonal to India's own argument about its own nationhood. That is that every ethnicity, every religious community can live with equal rights and protections of the state. So this is clearly a demand that's unreasonable. So why does the Pakistan army make this argument? Well, it's very simple. Without adhering to this demand, they have no legitimate claim on Kashmir, right? Their argument upon Kashmir is largely ideological. Without Kashmir, partition is not complete because Kashmir is the only Muslim dominant state. So part of, you have this sort of vicious circle in terms of Pakistan, the army's imagination about its ideology and its demands upon Kashmir. You both have to have this support for the ideology to support the demand for Kashmir, and if you let go of the demand for Kashmir, you're letting go of Pakistan's ideology. And in one of the articles that I read, Pakistan, without its strict adherence to the two-nation theory, isn't worth defending. And the reason for that is very simple. It's just a failed version of India, right? Very closely related to this is that India is depicted as civilizationally Hindu. Now, I know this just sounds really crazy, but if you read their literature, and by the way, a really easy source for you to go if you find that you're not able to wake up in the morning without enough coffee and you just want to have the fear of dog put in you, go and read Halal. Hilal. It's published by ISPR. You can get it on their website. It's published monthly. And just about every month there's going to be some crazy article in there that you can't believe some fool actually wrote, but there it is, and you can read it. So this idea that India is civilizationally Hindu is, of course, part and parcel to its obsession with the two-nation theory. It's also closely related to this other concept that you see in its defense literature, and that is that every war that Pakistan has fought has been a defensive jihad. So, I taught at LUMS a few years ago. If you've got Pakistani friends and associates, ask them what they were taught in school. India started every war, according to the Pakistani curriculum. And of course, this isn't true. Actually, Pakistan started every war, with the possible exception of the 1971 war, and that was a very different critter that we can discuss if there's any interest in that. So in Pakistan's ideology, or in the Army's retelling of its history and relations with India, India started every war, and therefore Pakistan's response to it has been a defensive jihad. And you'll see in its literature, the defense literature, going back to the 50s, that Pakistan began nursing this idea of infiltration. And what's actually interesting about that is that they learned that from us. So from 1954, the Americans and the Pakistanis were tied through the Mutual Defense Pact, and also through CETO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, formerly known as the Baghdad Pact until Iraq pulled out. The Americans are not actually a partner. We were only an observer to CENTO. But of course, we were partners with Pakistan because we wanted Pakistan to help us fight insurgencies, particularly in Southeast Asia. And what the Pakistanis were learning from our training materials was how to wage an insurgency. So I've got this one article that basically identifies a whole checklist of all the things that they need to do to sustain an insurgency in a jungle, mountainous terrain. Now, they don't say Kashmir, but you'd have to be pretty much a doofus to not realize that this is Kashmir. And so this idea of infiltration, of people's war, of non-state actors being an element of Pakistani strategy to manage India, a much larger nemesis, you see in Pakistan's literature very, very early, literally from the first issue that's available from the Pakistan Army Journal. And so I want to point out at this moment that this is very much in contradistinction to the conventional wisdom that Pakistan began doing this stuff in the 1990s. Pakistan has been doing this since the beginning. And as a reminder, the very first war it fought in 1947 was initiated when tribal marauders, with support from both provincial government as well as federal government, went into Kashmir and sought to seize that territory for Pakistan. Pakistan rightly concluded in that case that maybe this isn't a bad idea. Had it not been for those marauders, Pakistan would have had none of Kashmir as opposed to about half of Kashmir. So this idea of defensive jihad, of India starting every war, these things are all very closely interknit in the ways in which Pakistan defends what it does in terms of its non-state actors, in terms of its non-state actor policy. The other important issue that I want to draw out here, because it's also, I think, the conventional wisdom really understates the nature of the problem, is the introduction of nuclear weapons into Pakistan's strategy. So as Pakistan begins to see itself, and by the way, it does this in the 70s. It does this before any Indian strategist even thought of hard power projection. Pakistan begins identifying itself as the only country that can resist India's hegemony. These are the words that Pakistani writers use. The Indians don't use this word for quite some time, and still Indians are like, who says we're the regional hegemon? Like, well, I don't know, you kind of look like one, you kind of smell like one, but that's a different debate with Modi coming to town. We'll save that debate for later. But Pakistan identifies this job for it. I mean, it doesn't want to be a Bangladesh. It doesn't want to be a Nepal. It doesn't want to be a Bhutan. It wants to be, and it wants to be seen as India's rival, as India's peer, as India's equal. And obviously, India finds this to be very problematic. The way in which it sees itself as being India's equal is through nuclear weapons. Many people think of Pakistan as a relatively recent nuclear weapon state. I know my colleague Paul Kapoor, he puts the overt nuclear weapon period starting in 1990. I love Paul dearly, but he got that all wrong. So what do we know about Pakistan's nuclear weapons program, both from what they've written and then from things that we've subsequently learned? So Zulfikar Ali Bhutto actually was a proponent of Pakistan developing a nuclear weapons program in 1964. Why 64? Well, in 1962, India had been defeated by China in their war. And in 1964, the Chinese tested a device at Lopnor. And Zulfikar rightly understood that China's test and the emerging non-proliferation structure would incentivize India to want to develop a nuclear weapon. And India's nuclear infrastructure was much older than Pakistan's. It actually began during the period of the British. So some of India's first nuclear scientists studied with people like Rutherford Bohr. So for those of you who remember college chemistry, the Bohr model of the atom, there you go. The Indians were studying with these fellows. In contrast, Pakistan's program didn't really exist at all, except on paper. And when it did exist on paper, it began in the 50s. And it was just basically a lousy office covered with a bunch of crap. And Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was very worried about this. And he presented his concerns to Ayub Khan, then the military dictator. And Ayub said, no, if we pursue a nuclear weapon, we're going to irk all of our Western allies. In any event, we can get it off the shelf if we need it. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was not convinced that this was an appropriate response. And he was even more concerned after the 1965 war when Pakistan's allies did not come to its defense. Now, we, being one of its allies, we had no reason to come to its defense because the treaties were all about communist aggression and Pakistan started the war, but Zulfikar was not going to be persuaded by these things called facts. So it wasn't until after the 1971 war and the loss of East Pakistan, when the army was completely demoralized, sidelined, that Zulfikar was able to begin the nuclear weapons program with alacrity. And it was under Zulfikar that A.Q. Khan began his nuclear trafficking activities, and of course he wasn't the only one. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto writes in his book, If I'm Assassinated, and of course he was assassinated, that when Zia took over, when Zia staged the coup in 1977, they were on the cusp of having a nuclear weapons program. And for years, many people thought that that was nonsense, but now we know that that actually wasn't nonsense. Feroz Khan, in his book, Smoking Grass, or that's not the, what's that called? Eating Grass, oh my bad, concedes that Pakistan had a large crude weapon that it could stick off of a transport aircraft in extremis around 84. In April of 79, I want to remind you that we sanctioned Pakistan for making progress in enrichment. So this tells me that we knew that Pakistan was onto something. When you read Pakistan's own literature, they talk about not what they have, but about uncertainty over what they may have. And so there's an implicit recognition that there's this nuclear overhang. In other words, they understood that India could not simply respond to Pakistan militarily as a result of various acts of aggression because of the possibility that Pakistan might have a nuclear capability. And so when you put that timeline farther back, as I suggest you should, you can actually account for a lot of very strangely aggressive things that Pakistan was doing in the 1980s that you can't otherwise account for. So at one point in the 1980s, Pakistan is not only running the jihad in Afghanistan with our and Saudi money, it's also ramping up massively so the Sikh insurgency. In fact, the two countries nearly came to war over Pakistan's support to the Sikh insurgency. And it also began ramping up the Kashmir insurgency, and it was continuing supporting the insurgents in northeast India. So I argue in the book that understanding Pakistan as a nuclear power from 1990 onward really does violence to Pakistan's own understanding of its capabilities and what its own perceptions enabled it to do. The final thing, going back to my question, why does Pakistan do what it does, even though it's not entirely apparent that this is a useful strategy? It turns out that Pakistan has a very different sense of defeat. It doesn't have to defeat India. It simply has to prevent India from exerting its will on Pakistan. And so in this sense, Pakistan's like an international insurgent. It really is the Black Knight. I mean, the certain genius of my husband in recognizing that, I owe him lots of thanks, because it's true. Even after the 1971 war, if we just came up with a game called India and Pakistan, and we gave the rules, here's your objectives, here's your wherewithal to achieve your objectives. After about 7 minutes, the 14-year-old that got stuck with the Pakistan hand would have said, screw this, I'm going to go play TiVo or something, or whatever it is that these youngsters do. I don't even know what they do because I have no children. But even the 14-year-old would realize that Pakistan is a losing hand. So why does Cargill? I mean, if we were to play Cargill the game, whoever got stuck with Pakistan would have, I'm leaving, 7 minutes into it, they're done. But what was made clear to me when I actually began talking to a former Army chief when I was studying why you did what you did at Cargill, a very soft-spoken Army chief who doesn't lie very well said it to me very bluntly. He said, we can't defeat India conventionally. So our choices are do nothing, right? And to do nothing is essentially to acquiesce and to be defeated by India, or to do something with the full knowledge that what we're going to do may not produce the results that we would like, but it demonstrates that India just can't have its way with us. So that's the conclusion. Pakistan is an international insurgent. It does what it does, not for reasons that we think it does, and the tools and the policies that we have crafted towards Pakistan, I argue in the book, are really not going to produce a Pakistan. We can't change Pakistan. We can't reform it. We can't help it develop a new ideology. The best thing that we can really do is to back off, stop the methadone treatments, stop the welfare checks, and create an environment where Pakistan has to bear the full responsibility for its actions. Thank you.
I have a question in regards to Pakistan's strategies and how you recommend the U.S. extricate itself from the region in terms of foreign policy. If you say that Pakistan's strategies have failed, categorically they failed in achieving their goals. How do you suggest, by ending appeasement, do we resolve the issue of their having nuclear weapons and the possibility of nuclear war between India and Pakistan?
Okay, so I didn't recommend that we retrench from the region. So let me clarify what I'm advocating. The first thing we have to realize about Pakistan's nuclear weapons is that it's a pretty common refrain around town that sanctions failed. That's because they had the people who make that argument have a really bad understanding of our sanction policy. They didn't fail. They weren't ever in place, right? Because we put sanctions in place in April '79, and then as soon as the Soviets crossed the Amu Darya, and actually a little before that, because the summer of 1979, the Carter administration decided that it was going to have to relax its concerns about nonproliferation to find some way of working with Pakistan. So in that very crucial period, in fact, the Carter administration was even contemplating sanctioning Pakistan in '77. So within that crucial period when Pakistan was on the threshold, the U.S. government decided that it was not going to prioritize non-proliferation concerns, and it was instead going to continue investing in Pakistan because of the Soviet threat, with full knowledge that it was continuing to proliferate. So here's the problem that we have. And by the way, this was why we have the Fassler Amendment. The Fassler Amendment wasn't written to punish Pakistan. It was written to allow the U.S. government to continue funding Pakistan despite the interagency concerns that it was proliferating. So in 1990, and the Fassler Amendment was, I might add, was passed in 1985. So we're at this, I'm of the view that whatever could have been done to prevent Pakistan from proliferating really wasn't tried in earnest. And that's a very different story from saying sanctions failed, because I'm saying sanctions were never actually applied in earnest during that period when they actually mattered. So here is our real problem with Pakistan. Pakistan uses nuclear weapons to coerce India, as you noted. So, for example, after the Jaish-e-Mohammed attack on the Indian parliament, there was a very large mobilization. India eventually backed down. So nuclear optimists would say that nuclear deterrence held, right? That it prevented a large-scale conflict from breaking out. The problem with that is that nuclear weapons also enabled these low-level incursions to take place in the first place, right? Pakistan, under its nuclear umbrella, with greater impunity, supports these non-state actors. All right, so the other thing that it does with its nuclear weapons is it compels us. Because when we see these episodes, the Americans, the first thing that we do is we go sit on the Indians. And we say, don't do anything to provoke. Just sit there and just take it. And the other way in which Pakistan compels us or coerces us with its nuclear weapons is that they know that we're afraid of the Islamist barbarians of the nuclear gate. That's why we want a big giant embassy, so we can have a big aid program, so we can put spies in there, right? So I don't articulate this in this book, but where I've articulated elsewhere, is that what we have to do is take ourselves out of this coercion loop, because basically the Pakistanis rely upon us to shield them from the consequences of their own behavior. So this means making it very clear that we're no longer going to play the broker. Did you ever see Popeye when you were a kid?
Yes.
Okay, so you remember, and then it pans out, and there's just holding right here on his forehead, right? We have to stop doing this, putting our hand on the forehead, and just let him go at it. And by communicating that very clearly, then the ball is in India's court. How will the Indians respond to this? And this, the Indians themselves are really in a state of flux about how they want to handle this Pakistan issue. The Vajpayee government was floating this idea of cold start. Manmohan Singh got cold feet. I'm anticipating Modi is going to try to create something between do nothing and do everything to try to create some flexibility. But what I'm going to argue is that we have to stop playing the umpire, because Pakistan relies upon us to play the umpire. The second thing that we really need to do is that we need to get over this idea that we can purchase influence with the Pakistanis. In other words, that just by being there, we have influence and insights into their nuclear weapons program. If we do have those things, I don't see any evidence of it. So in this sense, I'm also an advocate of taking us out of their coercion loop. If your weapons in which we know their nuclear signature to some first order approximation because we have some pretty good intel about their proliferation. If your materials fall into the hands of non-state actors and they're used nefariously, we're going to hold you responsible because you say you're a responsible nuclear weapon state. And so this is another way of pulling us out of their coercion loop, because ultimately what they're trying to do is make sure that we never leave and take our checkbook with us. Now, this does not mean don't engage. I'm not saying write them off and do nothing, but I think we should treat them more like the Soviet Union, right, than an ally. And what do we do with the Soviet Union? We collaborated and cooperated when it served our purposes. We never cut off intelligence ties. We never cut off our ambassadorial connections. We never closed down our embassies. But we also were under no illusions that this country is an ally. And I think for too long, we have wanted to treat Pakistan like it's a friend, because the reality that it's not is just too hard to swallow. But I think that is the reality. It's not a friend. It's more of an enemy than it is anything else.
Hi, my name is Monica, and I'm a former student at the United States International University, which is in Kenya. And I'm interested in future study. So, in a nutshell, what do you think, as an expert in the topic, what do you think is the future of India and Pakistan?
Well, so India, right? So look, India has a challenge, right? Prime Minister Modi has a past which everyone knows very well. Now, I will say, Modi did make a really important speech in front of the Lok Sabha, saying that India has to address the various disparities that Muslims experience in India. There was a really important report that the government of India did a few years ago that laid out in really clear detail how disadvantaged Muslims are, even relative to the lowest caste that exists in India's social structure. So India knows full well that now also I should point out that India's Muslim populations are incredibly diverse. In Kerala, for example, very high degrees of human capital development, whereas in the north tends to be lower in human capital development because those were primarily the wealthier families, the educated families. Many of those fled to Pakistan, and essentially a brain drain. So I don't want you to think that there is a India Muslim population. That's just not true. And you've also seen the arrival of Indian Muslim political parties that are Muslim-led, but they're not Islamist. And in some cases, their primary competitors are caste-based political parties. So India has a couple of challenges ahead of it. Is this a prime minister for all Indians? Has he really jettisoned his communal past? I'm a skeptic. Until he says very clearly to the VHP and the RSS, I'm done with you, and your communal agenda is no longer appropriate for India, I'm going to be skeptical. But he's not going to do that because he's going to alienate his base if he does that right away. India also has made really important strides in poverty alleviation. I mean, even though Indians have not been satisfied with what Manmohan Singh did, he did really important things. Well, I watched our retirement funds crash. India still managed to basically have positive GDP growth. So Indians may not have been happy with what they had it better than a lot of other countries. So India is on an upward trajectory. The first time I went to India and Pakistan in 1991, Pakistan was so much better in terms of quality of life. That's just reversed. I mean, India has just made leaps and bounds forward in terms of empowerment of women, in terms of fully employing women in their human capital and in the labor market. It's just unspeakable, the differences. So in some sense, you can't compare India and Pakistan. The only reason we speak of them in the same sentence is because Pakistan has a revisionist agenda. India wouldn't care about Pakistan if it weren't for Pakistan sending terrorists to India. So I don't necessarily like to even discuss them in the same sentence because they share a border, but they don't share a destiny. Pakistan has big problems. When Pakistan chose to make Islam its national identity, it created for itself the problem that it's currently in. When it passed the objectives resolution that basically said we're going to be a country beholden to the laws of Allah, it created a permanent job for the ulama to say who is an appropriate Muslim and who's Muslim enough. And that's never something you want to trust to religious entrepreneurs, not in any country, not here, not in Pakistan, not anywhere. They first, and of course the first problem with this was that you had 25% of Pakistan's population weren't even Muslim, right? They were Hindu, mostly in East Pakistan, but also Sikh, Christian, mostly Sikh, Christian, and Hindu, with the largest concentration being the Hindus in East Pakistan. So they were already excluded from the state project. Once you've excluded them, and in some sense the succession of East Pakistan clarified that, because you got rid of most of Pakistan's Hindus, they began going after Shia, they began going after Ahmadiyya. And when this ideology became fused with the tools of Pakistan's foreign policy, which was creating a veritable zoo of these Islamist militants, you create a situation that Pakistan cannot easily escape from. Now these Deobandi militants, and Deobandism is a particular sectarian tradition in Pakistan. By the way, it's the same tradition that the Pakistan Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, these anti-Shia groups espouse. They've now decided that Pakistan's Barelvis, who are the traditional Sufis, are not adequate Muslims, and they're attacking their shrines. And they're doing it, and by the way, the Afghan Taliban did not do this when they were in charge of Afghanistan. They may have put a padlock on the Naqshbandi shrines, but they didn't destroy it. The Pakistan Taliban, in contrast, are destroying these shrines. They're calling them munafiqeen, a variety of other things. So Pakistan, first and foremost, if it wants to get out of this, it needs a different state ideology. It needs a different way of thinking about citizenship and about the Pakistani state project. And given the Pakistan Army's investment to this particular one, and I don't see Pakistan's civilian leadership having the testicularity and the vision to put forth a different way forward, and given the path dependency, because so much of this is rooted in Pakistan's curriculum, in its not-so-civil society, it's hard to imagine Pakistan getting out of this. So this does not mean, though, that this doesn't have implications for India and Pakistan, because every time one of these terrorist groups conducts an operation in India, India has to decide, do we want to treat this as a non-state actor without ISI's imprimatur, or are we going to treat it as basically an action that has a return address that says GHQ? And so as these terrorist groups in Pakistan proliferate, and as they develop resources that are outside of the ISI, you basically are, Pakistan is playing with fire, because any one of these militant groups could do something in India, and India is going to choose to respond. And especially with this particular leadership in Delhi, they're not going to put up with this nonsense. So it's going to be an interesting couple of years for sure. For those of you that want to study South Asia, I see job security in perpetuity.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.